I never imagined I would be standing in front of an entire office, stripped of everything I had worked for, humiliated in a way that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. But my name is Alec Rose, and this is the story I wish I could forget. But can't. Because once it happened to me, I realized it wasn't just my story. It was bigger, heavier, darker. For years I thought I knew who I was and where I stood. My life was ordinary, predictable. I woke up every morning at 6, brewed the same cup of coffee in my chipped white mug, and headed into the office like clockwork. My co-workers knew me as dependable, maybe a little quiet, but always the one you could count on to finish a project, to help without being asked, to do the kind of work that kept everything moving even if no one clapped for it. And for a long time that was enough for me. I didn't crave the spotlight. I didn't fight to be the loudest voice in the room. I believed my work would speak for me. And maybe, deep down, I believed the world was fair enough that if I just kept my head down and did my job, things would turn out right. Looking back now, I realize how naive that was. The office had its own rhythm, paper shuffling, keyboards clacking, the low hum of gossip floating through cubicles. But beneath all of that, there was something else. Something I tried not to see. The quiet jokes I wasn't supposed to hear. The way my name came last in meetings, or not at all. The stolen credit for ideas I had worked nights on. I brushed it aside, telling myself maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe it wasn't intentional. But deep down, I knew. The air carried a heaviness I couldn't quite name. And then came that morning. It started like any other. I walked in with my coffee, sat down at my desk, and opened the same spreadsheet I had been working on the day before. But something felt off. Conversations hid as I walked past. Eyes darted away when I looked up. My chest tightened, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe I was overthinking again. Minutes later, a voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. "Alec, conference room, now." I froze. My stomach dropped. I wasn't expecting a meeting. I glanced at the clock, then at my notes, trying to remember if I had missed an email. My legs felt heavy as I stood, and each step down that hallway felt like walking deeper into something I couldn't escape. When I opened the door, my world shifted. Every chair was filled. Co-workers sat lined in rows, their faces a strange mixture of pity and satisfaction. At the front stood my manager, holding a stack of papers like a judge holding a verdict. My throat tightened. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And then the words came. Words that would echo in my head for weeks afterward. "You're done here." Just like that. No reason I could fight. No explanation that made sense. Just a sentence sharp enough to cut my entire world in two. My knees felt weak. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, to plead for someone to see me, but my voice wouldn't come. The silence in the room was worse than the words themselves. Some people gasped quietly. Others looked down, refusing to meet my eyes. And then there were the ones who smirked, who looked almost relieved to see me fall. That hurt the most. To realize that people I had trusted, people I had helped, were perfectly fine watching me burn. I walked out of that room with my head spinning, my hands trembling. I felt small, disposable, erased. My chest burned with shame and anger, and the sound of muffled laughter followed me down the hall like a knife twisting deeper. And then, when I thought I couldn't sink any lower, something happened that I still can't explain. As I stumbled toward the exit, trying to hold myself together, the janitor, someone no one ever paid attention to, stepped out from the corner. His eyes met mine, steady, knowing. Without saying a single word, he reached into his pocket and pressed something into my hand. A key. Cold, heavy, ordinary looking. But the way he placed it there made my skin prickle. No explanation, no whisper, just that key, and the weight of his stare, as if he was silently telling me, "You need this. You need to see what it opens." I clutched it tightly, confusion racing through me. Why me? Why now? What was this about? My humiliation had been unbearable, but in that instant, fear and curiosity tangled inside me like fire and ice. Something about that moment told me this wasn't random. This was a thread, and if I pulled it, everything I thought I knew about my life, my job, maybe even my community, would unravel. And I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, maybe more than one person, didn't want me to find out what was waiting on the other side of that lock. I stood there in the hallway, staring at the key like it was burning a hole through my skin. The humiliation of the conference room was still fresh, my ears ringing with the sound of my manager's cold voice and the awkward silence of people I thought were my friends. But now, layered on top of that shame, was something else. This strange, gnawing curiosity. Why would the janitor give me this? He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His eyes told me enough. There was something I needed to know, and somehow I was the one who had to uncover it, Soul. My legs felt weak as I stumbled out of the building, the key tucked tightly in my palm. The sun was too bright that morning, almost mocking. People rushed by on the sidewalks outside, laughing, talking, carrying on with their ordinary lives. Meanwhile, mine had just been ripped apart. My heart ached with anger. I wanted to scream at them. "Don't you see what just happened? Don't you understand?" But of course, they didn't. To them, I was just another person walking down the street. Holding back tears, I went home, locked the door, and sat at my kitchen table with the key in front of me. I stared at it for hours. My mind spun with questions. Did it open a closet at the office? A locker? A storage room in the basement? Or was it something outside the building altogether? Every scenario raced through my head. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to pretend none of it existed. I had already lost my job. Wasn't that enough? Did I really want to drag myself deeper into whatever secret this key belonged to? But another part of me, a louder part, refused to let it go. I had felt the sting of being erased, the way they looked at me like I didn't belong. I had swallowed years of little slights, ignored the whispers, forced myself to believe things would change. And now, standing at the edge of losing everything, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Next day, I went back. Not through the front door. Not after what they had done to me. I slipped around the side of the building, my heart pounding as if I were committing a crime. The janitor's closet was tucked away near the loading dock, a place most employees never noticed. My hand shook as I pulled the key from my pocket. It slid into the lock with an ease that made my stomach twist. The door creaked open, and a rush of musty air hit my face. At first, it looked like nothing more than cleaning supplies. Mops, buckets, old bottles of bleach stacked against the wall. But then I saw it, a small locked cabinet tucked in the corner, hidden under a tarp. My breath caught. I pulled the tarp away, and there it was, the real lock this key belonged to. My hands trembled as I turned it, and when the door swung open, the world tilted. Inside were boxes, dozens of them, each labeled with names, familiar names. People I used to see in the office every day. People who had suddenly disappeared, let go, or moved without explanation. My stomach knotted as I pulled one of the boxes closer. I opened it and froze. Inside were files, photographs, notes written in sharp, cold handwriting. Observations about people's habits, their families, even their private lives. It was like someone had been watching them, tracking them, building a case against them for reasons that had nothing to do with their work. And then I saw something that made me feel sick. Each file had a label. Not about performance. Not about mistakes. But about things that should never matter. Things like race, background, language spoken at home. Cold words scribbled across the pages. Doesn't fit in. Risk to the culture. Better replace. My chest tightened. I felt dizzy, my hands gripping the box as though it might anchor me. It wasn't just me. It had never been just me. One by one, the faces of people who had vanished from the office flashed in my mind. The woman who used to share her lunch with me. The quiet man from accounting. The family who packed up and left town in the middle of the night. I used to think they'd just found other jobs or wanted a fresh start. But here was the truth, staring me in the face. They hadn't left by choice. They had been pushed. And then my eyes landed on the box at the bottom of the cabinet. It had my name on it. For a moment, I couldn't move. My throat closed, my body numb. With shaking hands, I lifted it out and opened the lid. Inside were photographs of me, walking into work, sitting at my desk, even leaving the grocery store late at night. Notes scribbled about how I failed to blend in, how my presence caused tension. Words so cold and detached, as if I were nothing more than a problem to be solved. I slammed the lid shut, my chest heaving. My hands were clammy, my knees weak, and for a moment I thought I might collapse right there on the floor. This wasn't just workplace gossip. This was a system, a plan, and I was the next one on their list. Suddenly, I heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway outside. I froze, my entire body tense. Someone was coming. I quickly shoved the box back into the cabinet, slammed the door shut, and locked it again with trembling hands. My heart pounded as I pressed myself against the wall, praying the darkness would hide me. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, and then I pressed my back against the cold wall of that tiny closet, every muscle in my body locked in place. The footsteps outside had stopped, and the silence was so heavy it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. My lungs burned as I tried not to breathe too loudly, my ears straining for the smallest sound. The doorknob rattled, my heart jumped into my throat. I clutched the key so tightly it dug into my palm, a reminder that I was holding on to something I wasn't supposed to see. For a split second, I imagined the door swinging open, a hand grabbing me, My secret discovery ending right there in that dim, suffocating space. But then, just as quickly as it started, the rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the distance until the hallway went quiet again. I stayed frozen, counting each second. 1, 2, 3. By the time I reached 50, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to move, to leave before someone else came back. I slipped out of the closet, locking it behind me, and walked as calmly as I could down the back stairwell, though inside I was shaking. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of the fluorescent lights made me flinch. I half expected someone to jump out, to accuse me, to drag me back into that conference room and expose me as if I were the criminal. When I finally stepped out into the sunlight, it was almost blinding. The city moved on as if nothing had happened, as if my world hadn't just cracked wide open. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the key in front of me again, my mind replaying everything I had seen. The boxes, the names, the photographs, the cold words scribbled like judgments on people's lives. I couldn't shake the image of my own box, my own face staring back at me from those pictures. Reduced to nothing more than a problem to be removed, sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the files, the handwriting, the long list of names. I saw the families who had left, the co-workers who had vanished. And I realized something that made my stomach twist. It wasn't just about firing people. It was about pushing them out of the community, erasing them, making sure they were forgotten. For days, I wrestled with it. Part of me wanted to run, to throw the key into the river and pretend none of it existed. I was terrified. What if they already knew I had been in that closet? What if they came after me? The memory of those footsteps outside the door haunted me, but another part of me knew I couldn't just walk away. Because if I did, then everything I saw in those boxes, every face, every life, would stay buried. And one day, another person would sit where I sat, humiliated, erased, holding their own file marked with cruel words. So I started to dig. Quietly, carefully, I began connecting the pieces. I remembered the Johnsons who packed up their house in the middle of the night, no goodbye, no explanation. The Garcias who vanished after whispers of not fitting in. The Woos whose daughter I used to see playing in the yard. Until one day the yard was empty and the house stood dark. At the time I had told myself it was coincidence. People move, life changes. But now I knew better. I began writing everything down. Names, dates, little details I could remember. My hands shook as I scribbled across the pages of my notebook, trying to keep track of the pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. And the more I wrote, the more undeniable it became. This wasn't just about me losing a job. This was about something bigger, something rooted in hate. Still, fear wrapped around me like a shadow. Every time a car slowed near my house, I peeked through the blinds, my pulse racing. Every knock at the door made me jump. I knew, deep down, that if they realized what I had found, I wouldn't just be fired. I'd be silenced. And then, one evening, as I sat surrounded by my notes, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not outside my office this time. Outside my own home. The sound of gravel crunching under shoes. A pause. Then another step. I froze, my pen slipping from my hand. Warmt in Fell. Air felt heavy, thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath with me. I crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just a sliver. There, under the streetlight, stood a figure. Too far away to see clearly, but close enough that I knew they were watching. I let the curtain fall, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. I backed into the kitchen, grabbed the key, and clutched it to my chest like a lifeline. Because now I knew for certain. They hadn't just forgotten about me. They knew, and they were waiting. I pressed my back to the kitchen counter, the key still warm against my palm, and listened to the night like it was some living thing. The footsteps outside my house had stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It crawled under my skin, made my scalp prickle, made my breath shallow and quick. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but the idea of explaining what I'd found, of saying the words out loud, felt impossible. Who would believe me? Who would want to hear that the place I'd trusted had been quietly cataloguing people like we were disposable inventory? I told myself to be brave. I told myself to be smart. So I did the small, sensible things first. I double-locked the doors, shoved a chair under the deadbolt like some makeshift barricade, and pulled every curtain shut. I unplugged my laptop and hid the notebook with my names and dates in the freezer, because it felt absurd and safe at the same time. Then I sat on the couch in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, and I made a plan that felt both ridiculous and necessary. I needed proof beyond the boxes in that closet. I needed someone who would listen and act. The next day I did something I never imagined I would do. I reached out. At first I typed the message and deleted it 3 times, my fingers heavy with fear and doubt. Then I sent it to the one person who had once acknowledged me with more than a nod. Lena from HR, a woman who had always been quiet but careful, who had once stopped me in the hallway to ask if I was okay when I cried over a missed deadline. Her reply came back slower than my heart wanted, short but not dismissive. She agreed to meet somewhere public during lunch. Sitting across from her in a noisy cafe felt like standing in the middle of a storm. I told her everything, clipped and trembling at first, then spilling out faster than I could control. The boxes, the labels, the faces erased. Her eyes went from disbelief to a hard, focused attention that made me feel both seen and terrified. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand, and for a second I felt steadier than I had in weeks. "We can't just sit on this," she said, voice low. "But you know how dangerous this is, Alec. If we expose it, they'll come for us. They'll deny everything. We need a plan." Her words were a lifeline and a warning. We talked in whispers, sketching possibilities, legal counsel, local reporters, anonymous tips. I thought of the files, the faces, the way the labels had treated people like an illness to be quarantined. I thought of the Johnsons and the Garcias and the Woos, and how their lives had been uprooted. I thought of my own picture in that box. I thought of how quickly my co-workers had turned away when I was fired. How easy it had been for them to let me go. Together, Lena and I started collecting evidence. She had access to internal archives and payrolls. I had the key and the memory of that closet. I took pictures with my phone. Quick, shaky shots of the cabinet, the boxes, the tags. I copied names onto a USB drive and slipped it into my jacket like contraband. Every click of the camera felt loud, invasive. as if someone might hear and retaliate. Each night I slept in short bursts, waking at the smallest sound, convinced someone would break in and take everything back. Weeks passed in a haze of fear and determination. We met in parking lots, in parks, always somewhere public, always with strangers passing by. Lena connected me with a local journalist who had a reputation for taking on the big companies, the ones with deep pockets and cleaner reputations. He asked questions that made my stomach flip. Who else knew? Who had access? Who would benefit? I told him what I knew and what I feared, and he listened like the rest of the world should have listened to me years ago. But the more I pushed, the closer they came. Anonymous emails started showing up in my inbox. Short, polite threats that read like warnings. Careful, Alec. Some doors are better left closed. A car idled across the street from my apartment for 3 nights in a row. Its headlights off. Its engine a low hum that made my teeth ache. Once, I found a note slipped under my door that said, simply, stop. No signature. No explanation. Just an order. Fear tightened its grip, but it did something else too. It sharpened my resolve. I couldn't let them erase these people anymore. I couldn't go back to pretending I hadn't seen what the key had opened. I'd been pushed into a corner, but corners force you to look at the whole room. They don't let you ignore what's behind the furniture. Then came the day the story went live. The journalist ran a careful piece, not sensational, but damning. Documents, interviews, anonymous testimonies. He laid out the pattern, a coordinated effort to track and remove employees who didn't fit the company image. He named names in a way that made it hard to look away. The fallout was immediate. Lawyers called. HR sent terse memos. The company released statements full of syrupy corporate language about diversity and inclusion while denying any wrongdoing. Some co-workers reached out with apologies that felt thin and late. Others stayed silent. The people who had smiled when I was humiliated now avoided me like a stain. And yet there were moments of light. Strangers messaged that they had been watching, that they'd suspected for years but had been afraid to act. Former co-workers who had been forced out reached out in whispers, telling me what they'd lost, what they'd been told to do, how they'd been shamed into leaving. One by one, names that had been reduced to file labels began to become people again, with faces and voices and stories. But with every small victory came a darker cost. I received a call late one night. No voice, just heavy breathing, and my door was keyed by someone who had rattled the knob until my lock gave slightly, and my hands trembled as I tightened it back into place. Someone smashed the rear window of my car and left a rock with a message carved into it. Stay out of it. I swallowed the fear down like bitter medicine and kept going. Because I had seen the faces in those boxes and I couldn't unsee them. Because the janitor's key had unlocked more than a cabinet. It had unlocked my voice. And once your voice starts to speak, it becomes harder to silence. But I knew they were still watching. And I knew the next move they made could be the one that changed everything, for better or for worse. I kept telling myself to breathe, to think, to plan. But every night felt like a countdown. The threats escalated in small, cruel ways. Messages, vandalism, the eerie feeling of steps behind me when there was no one there. Until living felt like holding my breath and waiting to see if I could keep doing it. Lena and the journalist, became my lifelines, voices that cut through the panic and reminded me there was a path forward. But even so, some part of me flinched at every knock and every car that slowed too long by my building. They tried to make me small. They tried to make the story about me, about my mistakes, my temper, whatever they could dredge up to distract from the files. Lawyers called, asking me to retract, to sign non-disclosure agreements with the kind of polite steel that felt like chains. There were offers, money to keep quiet, apologies that smelled of strategy rather than remorse. I stared at those messages until the words blurred, and I could barely taste the coffee beside me. The choice felt impossibly heavy. Take the hush, protect myself from further danger, maybe move on. Or keep pressing, exposing names, pushing the company into the light, and risk everything. I chose the names. We organized. Lena reached out quietly to the people whose boxes had been found. Reaching them was like knocking on doors in the dark. Some answers came back in whispered emails. Some in the trembling voice of a man who had been told his accent was a liability. Some in the long silence of those who had already left town and couldn't bring back what they had lost. The journalist recorded interviews in a way that honored them. Not a spectacle, but a careful unspooling of what had been done to real people with bills, children, parents, lives. Every story added weight to the truth we were building. Public pressure swelled. Social media picked up the thread. People started sharing their own experiences, stories of being passed over, of managers who asked invasive questions about family and background, of HR memos that hinted at cultural fit as a euphemism for exclusion. The voices multiplied, and suddenly the carefully constructed denial the company wore like armor began to crack. But the cracks brought morbid reheat. Someone tried to break into my apartment again, this time prying at the back door with a crowbar. The sound of it woke me in a way that no text could. A metallic scrape that vibrated through the floorboards and into my chest. I called the police with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. They came, took a report, promised to patrol. The patrols were small comfort. Who cared if a file cabinet had been opened when people were being watched in their own homes? Yet in the chaos, there were moments of unexpected kindness. A neighbor I'd barely known began leaving a thermos of soup outside my door some nights. No note. Just food that warmed my hands and reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. A woman from the community center brought over blankets and offered to help me connect with local advocates. Strangers rallied to help shield my identity when I met with the journalist, offering spaces where a record of testimony could be kept safe. Those small human gestures wrapped around me like light through a crack. The legal push started to take shape. An activist lawyer agreed to look at the files pro bono after reading the journalist's draft. She moved with a fierce, precise energy that made me feel suddenly less like a frightened woman and more like a witness the world couldn't ignore. She filed complaints, demanded internal audits, and threatened civil suits that read like promises. We will not let this stand. The company responded with its usual polished statements about values and commitments. But the prosecutor's interest changed the tenor. Once legal gears began to turn, things became less about whispers and more about facts, evidence, and the people those facts represented. But the system moves slowly, and slow has its own violence. Each day of waiting was a day of fear and second-guessing. Friends who'd once been familiar faces in the office offered cautious support from afar. But some, when faced with subpoenas and the reality of being asked to testify, retreated into silence. I understood them in a way I didn't want to. His fight demanded more than moral support. It demanded courage that exacted a price. One morning, a package arrived at my door. It was a simple plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a single photograph. My manager's face, candid, smiling at a barbecue, and scrawled on the back in a hurried hand was one word: regret. I sat on the floor and let the photograph fall from my hands like a stone. The note could have been a taunt or a threat, or someone's private conscience finally cracking. I didn't know. All I knew was that the people involved were slipping, making mistakes, leaving breadcrumbs. The pressure mounted, and so did the stakes. A former employee who had been quietly helping us with information disappeared from the public view for a week. Calls to her number went unanswered until one evening she showed up at my door, eyes rimmed red, skin sallow, and told me in a voice that trembled how someone had come by her home and left a warning. She had been frightened into silence so quickly that months of bravery had been washed away by a single terrifying visit. Tears traced clean lines down her cheeks as she apologized for stepping back. I held her hands and felt the rhythm of someone who had been taught to shrink for survival, speak in soft, battered tones. I began to understand the machinery behind the files, the careful surveillance, the casual cruelty disguised as corporate policy, the way fear was used to dismantle someone's life. It wasn't chaotic, it was designed. Names were collected, conversations archived, small infractions magnified into moral deficits that justified professional exile. Finally, there was the hearing. It was held in a room with 2 bright lights and folding chairs, the kind of place where truth is meant to be stripped bare. I sat in the front row, my palms sticky with sweat, as people from inside and outside the company came forward. Some, it told their stories with trembling dignity. Others read statements, their voices steady with anger. The files were entered into evidence, each piece of paper a small revelation. A mirror held up to the faces I'd seen vanish. The room hummed with a collective ache as names were read aloud, the ones who had been erased finally being spoken. When I spoke, my voice broke halfway through. I felt every eye in the room like a hand on my shoulder. I told them about the day I was called into the conference room, about the key and the cabinet, about the photographs and the notes that reduced people to terms. I talked about fear and the weight of carrying knowledge that could put you in harm's way. I told them how my nights were haunted now, and how I had chosen to carry that burden because those files demanded to be seen. There was a long silence after I finished, the kind that isn't empty, but full of something heavy and real. After the hearing, the story rippled farther than I had dared imagine. Lawsuits followed. Executives were placed on leave, and the company's glossy statements were met with court documents and witness testimony. The names in the boxes started to be reclaimed publicly. Apologies came, some sincere, many not. But amid the legal wrangling, a community found its voice. People who had been pushed out began to tell their stories one by one, and each story made it harder to pretend the files had been an anomaly. And yet, even with the wins, I learned the truth of scars. They heal, but they leave marks. I couldn't go back to the person I had been before the key. I couldn't forget the looks, the 1,000 small indignities, the nights I lay awake listening for footsteps. I had been changed, hardened in places I didn't expect, tender in places I feared would never mend. There were victories, settlements that meant some people could afford to breathe again. Policy changes at companies that had once thought they were above scrutiny. A small network of advocates formed from strangers who found each other when the files were opened. There were also costs, friends lost, innocence traded for experience, the persistent knowledge that systems like the one I exposed could morph and find new ways to hide. One evening, months after the first files, I stood on my balcony and watched the city lights blink awake. Lena's text chimed. They named the committee. We did it. I smiled even as my chest ached. It felt like a stitch in a wound, a small stubborn closure that might hold. But as the breeze lifted, I felt both relief and a hollow where fear had lived. The janitor's key had opened more than a cabinet. It had opened a truth that could not be stuffed back in a drawer. Yet I knew there would always be people who preferred silence. I knew pain leaves lessons that sometimes echo for a lifetime. Still, standing there under the night sky, I let myself breathe in. And for the first time in a long while, I believed the air might not be all danger. I believed that speaking had changed something, not just for me, but for others who had been catalogued and discarded. The next move, I understood, would belong to us, the people who decided to insist on being seen. And I was ready, whatever came next, to keep my voice